Someone wrote a letter, not a ransom note, not a threat, not a demand for money. A letter that says she is dead. A letter that says sorry. And here is the detail that should stop you completely. That letter was not sent to the Guthrie family. It was not sent to the FBI. It was not sent to the sheriff running the investigation. It was not sent to the lawyers, the victim advocates, the genetic genealogists, the retired federal agents who have been dissecting this case on television for 60 days. It was sent to journalists. Think about that decision for a moment, because it is not random. Nothing about this case has been random. The reconnaissance, the camera tampering, the flower pots holding the back doors open, the backpack, the mask, the gun. Every single element of this crime was planned. So the letter was planned too. The choice of who received it was planned. And whoever made that choice decided that the right audience for an apology about a dead 84-year-old woman was not her family. It was the press. Why? That question is the one that former FBI agents, criminal psychologists, and investigative journalists have been circling since the letter's existence was first confirmed by two independent sources on March 28th. And the answer, or rather, the range of possible answers, tells us more about the psychology of whoever took Nancy Guthrie than almost any other piece of evidence in this case. Because letters like this one do not exist in a vacuum. They have precedents. They have patterns. And when you place this letter inside those patterns, what emerges is a portrait of a person whose plan collapsed. A person who is now, 60 days later, doing something that professional criminals simply do not do. Feeling guilty. And that guilt, that crack in the armor of whoever did this, may be the single most important development in this investigation since the FBI recovered doorbell camera footage from back-end server data 9 days after Nancy Guthrie disappeared. Because forensic evidence can go cold, DNA samples can degrade, tip lines can go quiet, but guilt does not go cold. Guilt compounds. Guilt escalates, and guilt, in the hands of experienced federal investigators who know how to read it and respond to it, becomes a path toward an arrest. This is the story of that letter, what it says, what it means, what it reveals about the person who wrote it, and what it may still produce. Let's start at the beginning. Not the beginning of the letter, the beginning of the correspondence, because the letter did not arrive in isolation. It arrived at the end of a chain of communications that began the day after Nancy Guthrie was taken, and understanding that chain is essential to understanding what the letter means. February 2nd, 2026. One day after investigators believe Nancy was taken from her home in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona. A note arrived at Coldy TV, the CBS affiliate in Tucson. Separately, similar notes reportedly reached TMZ and at least two other Tucson television stations. The notes demanded payment in Bitcoin, millions of dollars. Two deadlines were included, February 5th and February 9th. The FBI said publicly that it was taking the notes seriously, but could not immediately verify their authenticity. That careful, measured language, taking it seriously, cannot verify, is the language investigators use when they see enough internal consistency to treat something as credible, but enough red flags to withhold confirmation. February 5th came. The deadline passed without resolution. February 9th came. The deadline passed again. No confirmed payment. No confirmed negotiation, no confirmed contact between the perpetrator and the family. The deadlines evaporated, and the case entered a new phase that investigators describe as the silence phase. The period following an unsuccessful ransom demand where the perpetrator, whoever they are, goes quiet and the investigation shifts from reactive to proactive. Then came the imposter. A man named Derek Colella was arrested and charged with sending a fraudulent ransom demand to the Guthrie family. One count of intent to transmit a ransom demand. One count of using a telecommunications device to anonymously harass. He appeared in court and was released. His case, disturbing on its own terms, clarified something important for investigators and for the public. The communication environment surrounding this case was compromised from very early on. Someone who had no connection to the crime, who had no knowledge of what actually happened to Nancy Guthrie, attempted to exploit the situation for reasons investigators have not fully disclosed. That exploitation poisoned the well. It made authenticating every subsequent piece of correspondence harder, more labor-intensive, more uncertain, which makes the authentication of the second letter, the apology letter, even more complex and even more significant. Two sources, independent of each other, speaking on the record, confirmed to multiple journalists covering this investigation from the ground in Tucson and from national desks tracking the case, the existence of a second letter sent to media organizations. A letter whose contents, according to those sources, do not resemble a ransom communication in any dimension. A letter that, as Megyn Kelly reported on her March 28th broadcast after citing social media posts corroborated by those sources, allegedly states that Nancy Guthrie has died, that it was not what was intended, that whoever sent it is sorry. Two sources, on the record, sorry. Investigators have not publicly confirmed this letter exists. They have not denied it either. That silence, that specific, deliberate silence from the FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Department in a case where they have been relatively communicative about other evidence, is meaningful in a way that experienced observers of federal investigations recognize immediately. Law enforcement does not confirm the existence of communications that are being treated as active evidence. Confirming the letter publicly alerts the sender, changes their behavior, may cause them to destroy other evidence or change locations, or take actions that close investigative doors that are currently still open. So the official silence is not the absence of knowledge. The official silence is strategy. Now let's go deeper into what we know about the letter's content, because the reported details, sparse as they are already telling investigators something critical. According to the sources who confirmed the letter's existence, it does not make a new ransom demand. It does not offer a location. It does not provide proof of death. It does not include any of the elements that would make it forensically useful as a direct evidence item in isolation. What it apparently does is communicate two things in simple terms: that Nancy Guthrie is no longer alive, and that the person writing is sorry for that outcome. That structure, acknowledgement and apology without actionable information, is what criminal psychologists call an incomplete confession. It is the kind of communication that emerges when someone needs to say something but cannot say everything, when the psychological pressure of carrying a secret has reached a breaking point, but the self-preservation instinct is still strong enough to prevent full disclosure. The person writes enough to release some of the pressure, but not enough to incriminate themselves beyond what is already known. The choice of the media as recipient is the critical behavioral tell, and it is worth examining in detail. When people with direct knowledge of a violent crime want to communicate with law enforcement without surrendering themselves, they have several options. Anonymous tip lines exist for exactly this purpose. Attorneys can facilitate communications that provide information without directly exposing a client. Religious institutions historically have served as intermediaries in cases of conscience. All of these channels exist. All of them are known. All of them would allow someone to say what they apparently needed to say without going to a newsroom. The choice of the newsroom is not about information. It is about audience. Criminal psychologists who have studied perpetrator communications in high-profile cases offer a consistent framework for understanding why someone in this position would choose to communicate publicly rather than privately. The media audience is not law enforcement. The media audience is everyone. The media audience includes Savannah Guthrie, who goes on television every morning and has said publicly that she imagines her mother's terror every night. The media audience includes the Guthrie family, who have been on national television begging for information, who have offered $1 million for anything that helps them find their mother. The media audience is the specific people the person writing the letter cannot face directly, because facing them directly means being identified, arrested, and prosecuted. The letter to the media is a confession to the people who matter without the legal consequences of a confession to the people who would act on it. That psychological maneuver, that specific attempt to discharge guilt without accepting legal accountability, is something the FBI has seen before. It is something they are trained to recognize and trained to respond to, because the person who writes an incomplete confession to the press is not done communicating. They have started a process, and processes that start tend to continue. Let's talk about what forensic linguistics tells us about who wrote this letter, because the words themselves, their structure, their vocabulary, their grammar, their emotional register are evidence of a kind that does not require a DNA match to be actionable. The FBI maintains one of the most sophisticated forensic linguistics programs in the world. The unit responsible for analyzing threatening communications, ransom notes, and perpetrator correspondence has contributed to the resolution of kidnapping cases, terrorism investigations, and homicide cases across multiple decades. Their methodology is precise. Their analytical framework is established science. And the documents they have almost certainly been given in this case, the original ransom notes and the alleged apology letter, are the kind of comparative corpus that forensic linguists describe as a significant opportunity. When two documents are written by the same person, they share linguistic fingerprints that survive even deliberate attempts at concealment, sentence length patterns, punctuation habits, the specific words a person reaches for when expressing certainty versus uncertainty, the grammatical constructions they default to under stress, the rhythm of their syntax, whether they write in short declarative bursts or in longer clause-heavy sentences, whether they use contractions or avoid them, whether they spell certain words in ways that suggest regional education or second language English or a specific generational vocabulary. All of these features are present in every document a person writes. They persist across documents written years apart. They persist through deliberate attempts to disguise them. Experienced forensic linguists can detect attempts at disguise. because the disguise itself reveals something about the person doing the disguising, how sophisticated the attempt is, whether it reflects knowledge of forensic linguistics or simply instinct, whether it was consistent throughout the document or applied only to certain sections. All of that is data. The FBI Forensic Linguistics Unit will be running two primary comparisons on the letter, assuming they have it. First, does this letter share linguistic fingerprints with the original ransom notes? If the same person wrote both, there will be consistent markers across the documents that cannot be explained by coincidence. Second, does the letter's linguistic profile match any existing database of known writings? Federal investigators maintain extensive databases of communications from individuals with relevant criminal histories, people who have been investigated for kidnapping, extortion, ransom demands, and related offenses. If there is a match, it narrows the field. If there is no match, it tells investigators something too. It tells them this person has not been in the system before, that this was a first offense, or that any previous offenses were handled in a jurisdiction whose records are not in the database. Criminal psychologist Dr. April Stonehouse, the forensic science professor at Arizona State University, who analyzed the flashlight and mouth detail from the surveillance footage, has spoken publicly about the significance of every piece of trace evidence in this case. The flashlight held in the suspect's mouth during the doorbell camera footage could contain saliva DNA. The mask that did not cover the suspect's mouth could have deposited biological material on surfaces inside Nancy Guthrie's home. The letter, physical or digital, could contain its own forensic signatures, paper and envelope fibers, ink chemistry, printer metadata if it was produced digitally, IP address echoes if it was transmitted electronically. All of it is potentially recoverable. All of it contributes to the profile. Now let's examine the precedents, because the history of criminal investigation is full of cases where communications from perpetrators, letters, notes, phone calls, coded messages, became the turning point that broke a case open. And understanding those precedents is essential to understanding why investigators are treating this letter with the urgency they are. The BTK killer case. Dennis Rader murdered 10 people in Wichita, Kansas, between 1974 and 1991. He went silent for more than a decade. And then, in 2004, he began communicating again. Letters to newspapers, packages sent to television stations, messages that contained evidence of his crimes, and claims that authorities could not verify without internal case files. That communication sequence, begun after years of silence, directed at the media rather than law enforcement, eventually led to a catastrophic mistake. Rader asked investigators, through the press, whether a floppy disk he planned to send them could be traced. Investigators published a response saying no. He sent the disk. The metadata on that disk contained his name, his church, and his location. He was arrested in 2005, 30 years after his first murder. The letter in the Nancy Guthrie case is not identical to the BTK communications. The circumstances are different. The timeline is compressed. The crime is different in nature. But the behavioral pattern, perpetrator communicating with the media, driven by a psychological need that overcomes their self-protective instinct, is recognizable. And the lesson of BTK is that once a perpetrator begins communicating, they tend to make mistakes. Escalating communications produce escalating risks of detection. The FBI knows this. They are patient enough to wait for the mistake. The Unabomber case offers another precedent worth examining. Ted Kaczynski sent letters and packages to universities and airlines for 17 years. His communications were ideological rather than confessional, but the core dynamic is the same. A person who has committed a serious crime and who cannot stop communicating about it eventually provides enough information to be identified. In Kaczynski's case, it was his own brother who recognized the writing style of the published manifesto and contacted the FBI. In the Guthrie case, the equivalent scenario is someone in the life of the person who wrote the letter recognizing a phrase, a turn of speech, a pattern of thought that connects the public letter to a private individual they know. That is why the family's public appeal matters as much as any forensic evidence. Every time Savannah Guthrie speaks on television, every time the family releases a statement, every time a journalist publishes a detailed account of the letter's reported contents, they are broadcasting to an audience that includes people who know the person responsible, people who may not realize what they know, people who may read a description of the letter's language and think, wait, I know someone who talks like that. I know someone who was in Tucson in late January. I know someone who came home different. That connection, that moment of recognition in the mind of someone who knows the perpetrator, is how most violent crimes are ultimately solved, not by forensic breakthroughs alone, by a person who decides that what they know is too important to keep to themselves. Now we need to address the question that Savannah Guthrie's family is living with every day, the question that the letter raises but does not answer, the question that is, in some ways, more unbearable than the original disappearance. If the letter is real, if Nancy Guthrie is gone, Where is she? The letter, as reported, did not include a location. It did not offer to lead investigators to her. It said she is dead, and it said sorry, and it said nothing else that helps the people who love her bring her home, which means that somewhere in Arizona, or across a border, or in a location that no helicopter has flown over and no cadaver dog has searched, there is an answer that only one person knows. Genetic genealogist Cece Moore, who has helped solve more than 300 cases using investigative genetic genealogy, told NewsNation in late March that she believes a second location must exist: a car, a property, a surface where Nancy Guthrie and the person who took her both left biological material, a location where the DNA that the FBI has been unable to cleanly separate from the mixed sample inside Nancy's home might exist in a purer, single-contributor form that is easier to profile and upload to ancestry databases. Moore said she believes something will eventually be found in that manner, but finding it requires finding the location, and finding the location requires either a tip from someone who knows, or a confession from the person responsible, or a forensic connection that investigators have not yet made. The letter, if it exists, is the closest thing to a confession this investigation has received, and it is an incomplete one, which means there is more to say, more to reveal, more that the person who wrote it knows and has not yet committed to paper or screen or voice. Let's talk about Savannah Guthrie, because her experience of this letter, if she knows about it, if the family has been informed of its existence, is something that deserves to be named directly and honestly. Savannah Guthrie gave her first interview since her mother's disappearance on March 25th. She sat down with Hoda Kotb. She said she imagines her mother's terror every night. She said the family is in agony. She said someone needs to do the right thing, and it is never too late. She said she fears that her mother was targeted because of her own fame, that the celebrity she built over decades as one of the most recognized faces in American television, morning news, may have reached into her mother's life and caused something she could not have prevented and cannot undo. She said, "I'm so sorry, Mommy. I'm so sorry." 3 days later, the existence of the apology letter was reported. Think about what it means to hear, not from the person responsible, not from law enforcement, not from a source who reached out to you directly, but from a newscast, from a social media post, from a journalist covering your mother's disappearance, that a letter has arrived somewhere saying your mother is dead and whoever did it is sorry. You did not receive that letter. The person who caused this did not come to you. They went to journalists. They chose, in the moment when they apparently needed to say something about what they had done, to say it to the press and not to the people whose lives they destroyed. Not to Savannah, not to Annie, who lives close enough to have had dinner with her mother the night she disappeared. Not to Cameron, who felt the ransom demand coming from the very first moment. To journalists. That specific cruelty, unintentional or not, is part of the psychological profile of whoever wrote this letter. They needed to release the pressure of what they know, but they were not ready to face the people they hurt. They chose the widest possible audience precisely because the widest possible audience is also the most diffuse one. No single person in a television audience can demand answers. No single person in a social media feed can force a reckoning. The family can. Law enforcement can. And so the family and law enforcement were bypassed in favor of everyone, which is to say, in favor of no one specific. That calculus is cowardice. And cowardice, in federal criminal psychology, is a characteristic that profilers use to narrow suspect pools. People who are capable of planning and executing a kidnapping with military-level precision, but who respond to its aftermath with cowardice. Letters to journalists instead of surrenders to law enforcement exhibit a specific psychological profile. High capacity for pre-crime planning, low capacity for post-crime management. The gap between who they believed themselves to be before the crime and who they discovered themselves to be after it is too wide to bridge through direct action. They bridge it with a letter, and then they wait to see what happens. What happens in the framework of federal investigation is that the letter becomes a tool, not just forensic evidence to be analyzed, a tool for active engagement. Law enforcement uses perpetrator communications to construct responses, not always public, sometimes channeled through specific media outlets or specific investigative reporting designed to provoke additional communication, to create conditions where the person who wrote the first letter feels the need to write a second one, a more detailed one that contains information that is actionable. This is not speculation. This is documented federal investigative methodology. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit has published extensively on the use of perpetrator communications as active investigative tools. The goal is not simply to analyze what was sent. The goal is to create conditions where more gets sent. And more information in a case that has produced very few clean forensic leads in 60 days is exactly what this investigation needs. Let's talk about the possibility that the letter is not authentic, because intellectual honesty requires examining that scenario too. The case for inauthenticity is not trivial. The communication environment around this investigation was corrupted very early by Derek Collella's fraudulent ransom demand. The ransom notes themselves were never publicly authenticated by law enforcement. Social media speculation about this case has been intense, often inaccurate, and occasionally deliberately misleading. The two sources who confirmed the letter's existence, while described as independent and on the record, have not been publicly identified by name. And the investigative journalists who reported their accounts are operating in a media environment where competition for exclusive details about this case is fierce enough that the pressure to report something new before competitors do is real and constant. If the letter is a fabrication, if those sources are wrong, or if they were themselves given false information by someone further down the chain, then the analysis of its psychological significance is interesting but irrelevant. The FBI is not pursuing a ghost. The Forensic Linguistics Unit is not analyzing a document that doesn't exist. But here is what makes the inauthenticity scenario genuinely unlikely. Two independent sources, on the record, confirmed to multiple journalists at multiple outlets. That is not the profile of misinformation that propagates through a single credulous reporter. That is the profile of information that has been independently verified before publication. And the specific content, an apology, a statement that Nancy is dead, no demand, no negotiation, is not the kind of content that benefits the people reporting it. A journalist with no genuine source claiming a letter says sorry gets nothing from that claim that advances their career or their outlet's competitive position the way a dramatic breakthrough will. The modesty of the letter's content, paradoxically, supports its authenticity. Investigators know this. They are operating with the assumption that the letter is real until their own analysis proves otherwise, and their analysis will prove it one way or the other. The forensic linguistics comparison with the original ransom notes will either confirm a common author or it will not. There is no ambiguity in that outcome. Now let's talk about what comes next, because the letter is not the end of this story. It is a turn in it. If the person who wrote the letter is still in contact range, if they are still in a location where they can receive information about the investigation and respond to it, then the conditions are present for additional communication. The FBI knows this. The Behavioral Analysis Unit has almost certainly already modeled the range of likely next communications and prepared response strategies designed to draw each of them out. The public pressure is part of that strategy. Every Savannah Guthrie interview, every family statement, every journalist who reports on the letter and asks who sent it, every retired FBI agent who appears on cable news and says the person who wrote this letter is one decision away from doing the right thing. All of it is directed at the same audience, the audience of one, the person who sent the letter, the person who knows where Nancy Guthrie is. Former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffindaffer said publicly that she still leans toward more than one person being involved in the abduction. But she acknowledged, on March 31st, as the letter's existence was becoming public, that a lone actor cannot be ruled out. And if this was a lone actor, the letter is even more significant, because a lone actor has no one to share the weight with, no co-conspirator to reinforce the silence, no network that has a stake in keeping information contained. Just one person, carrying everything alone, who finally picked up a pen or opened a laptop and said sorry to a newsroom because they could not carry it anymore in complete silence. That person is still out there, possibly within driving distance of Tucson, possibly across a border, possibly in a state that no one has considered yet, because the investigation has been focused on the immediate geographic radius of the crime. And that person is the only person who can answer the question that the Guthrie family needs answered above all others. Not who did this, not why, not how. Where is Nancy? That question, 3 words, is the only thing that matters now. And the only person who knows the answer sent a letter to a newsroom saying sorry instead of answering it. Savannah Guthrie said it. Annie Guthrie has said it. Cameron Guthrie, who knew from the very first moment that this was targeted, who anticipated the ransom demand before it arrived, who has been living with 60 days of silence and $1 million reward that has produced no arrest and no location. He has said it too. It is never too late to do the right thing. That is not a legal appeal. It is not a strategic communication designed by a law enforcement public relations team. It is a daughter and a son and a sister saying to the person who wrote the word sorry, if you mean it, show it. If the apology is real, the location is the proof. The letter is not enough. An apology to journalists is not enough. The right thing, the only thing that gives that letter any weight, any meaning, any claim to being something other than self-serving guilt management, is a phone call, a name, a set of coordinates, something that lets a family bring their mother home. The FBI tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. The Pima County Sheriff's Department is 520-351-4900. The family is offering $1 million for information leading to Nancy Guthrie's recovery. That reward does not expire with an arrest. It is specifically tied to her recovery, her return, her location. Someone wrote a letter. Someone knows more than that letter said. And somewhere, in a place that only that person has seen, there may still be an answer that a family has been waiting 60 days to receive. This is not just a story. It is a real life, a real family. A daughter who said, "I'm sorry, Mommy," on national television before she knew that somewhere, in a newsroom, a letter had arrived from the person responsible saying the same thing. Two apologies. One from a daughter who has nothing to apologize for. One from a person who has everything to answer for. Only one of them matters now. The search for truth continues. The timing. The letter did not arrive in the first week. It did not arrive during the peak of media attention, when the FBI released the surveillance footage, and the country was flooded with images of the masked man on Nancy Guthrie's porch. It did not arrive when the family released their first public plea. It did not arrive when the ransom deadlines passed, or when the gloves were found 2 miles from the house, or when the DNA from those gloves turned out to belong to a restaurant worker with no connection to the case. It arrived 60 days in. 60 days is a specific threshold in federal kidnapping investigations. It is the threshold at which the probability of a live recovery begins to shift in ways that law enforcement does not say publicly, but that every agent working the case understands. It is the threshold at which the FBI typically begins what investigators call a case recalibration, a structured reassessment of investigative assumptions and priorities based on the elapsed time and the state of the evidence. It is the threshold at which families begin receiving different kinds of conversations from their law enforcement liaisons than they received in the first 2 weeks. Someone who has been watching this investigation closely enough to understand its rhythm, closely enough to know when the FBI was reducing personnel in Tucson, closely enough to know when the Pima County Sheriff's Department issued its statement about refocusing resources, would understand what 60 days means, would understand that 60 days is the moment when the investigation transitions, when the energy that drove the first phase begins to plateau, when tips slow and headlines shift, and the country's attention, which is always finite, begins to find other places to go. The letter arrived at exactly that moment, 60 days in, when the investigation was visibly slowing. Was that timing coincidental, or was it calculated? Criminal psychologists who study perpetrator behavior in extended kidnapping cases describe a phenomenon called timeline awareness. Perpetrators who follow media coverage of their own crimes, and the evidence in this case strongly suggests the person responsible has been following coverage closely, given the surveillance footage's camera awareness, the Bitcoin ransom demands sophistication, and the cross-channel distribution of the original notes, develop an acute sense of the investigation's rhythm. They know when attention peaks and when it fades. They know when law enforcement momentum is building and when it is plateauing. And some of them, particularly those operating alone, particularly those carrying guilt without anyone to share it with, use that timing to calibrate their own communications. The letter at 60 days may not have been an accident. It may have been a response to the visible deceleration of the investigation, a communication sent at exactly the moment when the person responsible felt the pressure of detection beginning to decrease, and made a decision, driven by guilt rather than strategy, to re-inject themselves into the investigation's consciousness. If that is accurate, it tells investigators something critical about this person's psychology. They are not passive. They are watching. They are engaged with the coverage in a way that reflects continued psychological investment in the case's outcome. They have not detached. They have not moved on. They are still, 60 days later, oriented toward what is happening in Tucson and in the media and in the investigation, still present, in some psychological sense, at the scene of what they did. That continued orientation is a vulnerability. People who cannot disengage from the crimes they commit make mistakes born from that engagement. The BTK killer could not stop communicating. The Unabomber could not stop publishing. The person who sent a letter to journalists 60 days after taking Nancy Guthrie from her home could not stop themselves from writing it, even knowing, as they must have known, that every word was a potential forensic artifact. The compulsion was stronger than the self-preservation instinct, and compulsions that overcome self-preservation instincts tend to recur. Now let's talk about what happens inside the investigation when a letter like this arrives, because the public picture of this investigation, press conferences, tip line numbers, reward announcements, is a fraction of what is actually happening. And understanding the full scope of the investigative response to this letter requires understanding how the FBI's kidnapping and behavioral analysis infrastructure actually functions. The letter, upon receipt by whatever media organization first received it, almost certainly triggered an immediate contact with law enforcement. Responsible journalists covering this case have been in close communication with the FBI's Phoenix field office and with the Pima County Sheriff's Department throughout the investigation. A letter claiming responsibility for the crime and reporting the victim's death is not something a journalist holds for competitive advantage. It is evidence. It goes to law enforcement. Once law enforcement receives it, physically or digitally, a chain of custody is established. The document is logged, photographed, or digitally archived, and simultaneously routed to multiple analytical tracks. Forensic analysis, paper, ink, printing method, any biological trace. Forensic linguistics, the comparative analysis against the original ransom notes and against the database of known criminal communications. Digital forensics, if it arrived electronically, every metadata layer, routing information, IP address, timestamp, and device signature, all of it running simultaneously. The behavioral analysis unit's involvement would have been triggered within hours of the letter's receipt. Their assessment of the letter's psychological content, the nature of the guilt expressed, its specificity or lack thereof, the language used to describe Nancy Guthrie, the framing of the apology, feeds directly into the active case profile. It informs the decisions investigators make about how to publicly discuss the case in the weeks following the letter's receipt, what to confirm, what to deny, what to say in press conferences, what to omit, all of it shaped by the behavioral analysis team's assessment of what communications will most effectively draw out the next piece of information from the person who wrote the letter. This is the invisible architecture of the investigation. The public sees the press conferences and the tip lines and the reward announcements. The invisible architecture is a team of analysts in Phoenix and Quantico who are constructing, word by word, a response to the letter that the person who wrote it will receive not as a direct communication, but as the ambient noise of the investigation's public presence. Every statement from Savannah Guthrie that emphasizes it is never too late. Every retired FBI agent who appears on cable news and says the person responsible is clearly suffering, and that suffering means they are one decision away from doing the right thing. Every journalist who writes about the letter in terms that are sympathetic to the possibility that the person who sent it is not a monster, but a person who made catastrophic decisions and is now living with them. All of it is calibrated. All of it is aimed at one target audience of one person. That is not cynicism. That is sophisticated investigative communication strategy applied to a case where the forensic evidence has not yet produced an identification, and the only known direct communication from the perpetrator is an incomplete apology to journalists. You work with what you have. Let's talk about the family one more time, because in the forensic and psychological and investigative analysis of this letter, the family's experience of it risks being reduced to context, and they are not context. They are the reason any of this matters. Savannah Guthrie. She is 53 years old. She has been co-anchor of the Today Show since 2012. She is one of the most recognized faces in American morning television. She has interviewed presidents. She has moderated presidential debates. She has built a career on the ability to ask hard questions and receive difficult answers with composure and clarity and professionalism. And in the weeks since her mother disappeared, she has sat in front of cameras and cameras and cameras and said things that no professional composure can fully contain. She said she imagines her mother's terror every night. She said she is so sorry, Mommy. She said the family believes in a miracle. She said they also know she may be gone. She went back to work. She said it brings her joy. She smiled. Behind that smile is a woman who does not know if her mother is alive, who has been living in that specific, terrible uncertainty for 60 days, who sat in an interview on March 25th and made a direct appeal to whoever is responsible. Please, someone do the right thing. And then, days later, a letter arrived at a newsroom saying sorry. Not to her, to journalists. Annie Guthrie. She lives close enough to her mother that she had dinner with her on January 31st. She dropped her mother off at home. She said goodnight. She went back to her own house. And when the morning came and her mother did not appear for the church service, Annie was one of the first people to know something was wrong. She has been living with that knowledge, that the last moment she had with her mother was a normal evening, a dinner, a goodbye that she did not know was a goodbye, for 60 days. Cameron Guthrie, he felt it immediately. He told family members from the very first hours that this was a kidnap, that a ransom demand was coming. He was right about the demand. He is still waiting, like everyone else, for the answer to the question the demand never resolved. These are the people the letter was not sent to. These are the people who are still waiting. And this is the final thing that needs to be said about the letter, about what it is, stripped of all forensic and psychological and investigative analysis, stripped of the behavioral profiling and the linguistic fingerprinting and the documented federal investigative methodology and the precedents from BTK and the Unabomber. Stripped of all of that, the letter is a person saying they know what happened to someone's mother, saying she is dead, saying sorry, and then saying nothing else. That is not closure. That is the cruelest possible iteration of continued uncertainty. Because now the family, if they have been informed of the letter's existence, and there is no reason to believe law enforcement has not told them, is no longer waiting in the pure uncertainty of not knowing. They are waiting in a different kind of uncertainty. The uncertainty of a letter from an unknown person saying their mother is dead with no location, no proof, no body, no answer. A letter that might be true, a letter that might be false, a letter that might be the beginning of something, first crack in a silence that is held for 60 days, or a letter that is itself a dead end, another piece of evidence that generates analysis and produces no arrest. Savannah Guthrie said it is never too late to do the right thing. The right thing is not a letter to a newsroom. The right thing is a phone call, a location, a name, something that lets a family stop waiting. The FBI tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. The Pima County Sheriff's Department is 520-351-4900. $1 million for information leading to Nancy Guthrie's recovery. The reward does not require an arrest. It requires information that leads to her, to where she is, to the answer that only one person on Earth currently has. That person wrote a letter. That letter said sorry. Sorry is not enough. This is not just a story. It is a real life. A real family. An 84-year-old woman who went to church every Sunday and had dinner with her daughter on a Friday night, and was taken from her home in the dark, whose blood was found on her own front porch, whose pacemaker went silent at 2:28 in the morning, and a letter sitting in a newsroom that says she is gone, signed by the only person who knows where. The search for truth continues. Why write at all? Not why write to the media instead of law enforcement. Why write anything to anyone? Professional criminals who have committed crimes that went wrong do not write letters. They do not reach out. They do not communicate. They calculate the risk of every action against the probability of being caught by it, and they conclude, correctly, mathematically, that silence is safer than communication. Every word written is evidence. Every word sent is a transmission that can be traced. Every word received by a third party is a potential tip to law enforcement from that third party. Silence is the only rational strategy for someone who has committed a crime and wants to avoid detection. And yet the letter was written and sent, which means the person who wrote it is not operating rationally. They are operating emotionally. They are being driven by something that has overpowered their rational self-preservation calculus. And the only thing powerful enough to override a rational self-preservation calculus in the aftermath of a violent crime is guilt that has become unbearable. Guilt that has become unbearable is guilt that is looking for a way out. The way out that the letter offered was partial. It was insufficient. It did not resolve the guilt, because guilt of this magnitude cannot be resolved by an anonymous letter to a newsroom. The only resolution available is the kind that comes through the formal acknowledgement of what happened, through a conversation with law enforcement, through a location, through the kind of cooperation that allows a family to stop waiting and allows an investigation to reach its conclusion. The letter was the first step in a process that, if it follows the psychological pattern that criminal behaviorists describe, tends to escalate. The first step is the hardest. The letter is already written. It is already sent. The person who sent it has already crossed the threshold of communication. The threshold between total silence and any communication at all is, in the psychology of guilt-driven behavior, the highest threshold to cross. Once it is crossed, the next communication is easier, and the next one after that. And somewhere in that escalating sequence of communications, the information that this investigation needs tends to emerge. Federal investigators are counting on that. They are patient enough to wait. They have structured their public communications around creating conditions where the next letter, or the phone call, or the in-person approach, or the anonymous tip is more likely to happen than not. Every public statement from the Guthrie family that emphasizes humanity over accusation. Every retired FBI agent who says on national television that the person responsible is clearly suffering and that suffering means a resolution is possible. Every journalist who covers the letter with nuance instead of condemnation. All of it is aimed at one target. One person who is sitting somewhere with knowledge that a family needs and that an investigation requires, and that, apparently, a conscience can no longer hold in complete silence. The letter said sorry. The investigation is listening. The family is waiting. And somewhere, in a car, in a room, in a location that may still hold the answers this case has spent 60 days searching for, the rest of the story exists. Waiting to be found, waiting to be said, waiting for the moment when the person who wrote sorry decides that sorry alone is not what they can live with. Investigators believe that moment is coming. The Guthrie family believes it too. 1-800-CALL-FBI, 520-351-4900. $1 million for information leading to Nancy Guthrie's recovery. Someone knows. The search for truth continues. For 60 days, the dominant narrative of the Nancy Guthrie case has been a missing person case. An 84-year-old woman, taken, unknown location, unknown status. The investigation operating under the assumption, stated publicly by law enforcement, that she is alive until evidence proves otherwise. Cadaver dogs deployed and then placed on hold. Signal sniffer helicopters searching for a pacemaker's heartbeat. $1 million reward specifically structured around the word recovery, the language of possibility, the language of a search that might still end with someone coming home. The letter introduces a different narrative, not confirmed, not officially acknowledged, but present, reported by credible journalists with credible sources. A narrative in which the search has already answered its central question, and the answer is the one the family asked God not to deliver. That shift, from missing to gone, does something to an investigation. And it does something to the public that has been following it. And most importantly, it does something to the family. Because families of missing persons operate on a kind of suspended grief. They cannot fully mourn someone whose status is unknown. They cannot process loss when loss has not been confirmed. They hold themselves in a state of suspended animation, believing in the possibility of return, planning for the possibility of return, organizing their emotional life around the possibility of return, while simultaneously living with the knowledge that every day that passes makes return less probable. The letter, if true, ends that suspension, not cleanly, not with the certainty that allows grief to move forward, but with a reported claim from an unknown source with unknown credibility in a case that has already produced at least one fraudulent communication that the suspension is over, that there is nothing left to suspend. And then, immediately, the questions begin. Is the letter real? Is it from the right person? Did they tell the truth in it? Did they tell the whole truth? What does sorry mean when it comes without a location? What does dead mean when there is no body? What does the letter mean when law enforcement will neither confirm it nor deny it? The suspended grief becomes a different kind of suspended grief, not waiting for news of survival, waiting for confirmation of loss, waiting for the location, waiting for the letter to become something more than a letter, waiting for the sorry to mean something beyond the word itself. Savannah Guthrie went back to work. She said it brings her joy. That sentence, in the context of everything that surrounds it, is the most precise description of what it means to be a public person in private grief, to show up, to perform the role that thousands of people depend on you to perform, to smile because smiling is what you have left that belongs entirely to you, that nobody can take, that nobody can send a letter to a newsroom about. She smiled. And somewhere in a newsroom, a letter sat, saying sorry. That is the 60-day story of Nancy Guthrie, and the letter that arrived at the end of it. Not a resolution, not a breakthrough, a turn, a crack in the silence, a word, sorry, that means everything and explains nothing and leaves a family exactly where they were before it arrived, except now with the weight of what it implies added to the weight of everything they have already been carrying. The FBI tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. The Pima County Sheriff's Department is 520-351-4900. The family is offering $1 million. The search is still active. The letter is in a newsroom. And Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, mother of 3, woman of faith who never missed a Sunday church service, is still waiting to be found. This is not just a story. It is a real life, a real family, and a letter that said sorry when what the family needed was an answer. The search for truth continues, but it has not been said in the direct, unambiguous language that it deserves. The person who wrote that letter is not far away, not psychologically, and possibly not geographically. Here is the reasoning. Someone who commits a crime of this magnitude and then disappears, truly disappears, crosses a border, relocates to a different country, severs every connection to the environment where the crime occurred, does not write letters 60 days later. They are focused entirely on survival, on building distance, on constructing a new life in a new place where no one knows what they did. The psychological architecture of genuine flight is forward-facing. It does not look back. It does not reach backward toward the crime scene through a letter to a newsroom. The letter looks back. The letter is written by someone who is still, in some essential way, present in this story, still watching it, still consuming it, still experiencing it as something that is happening to them, not something that happened, past tense, in a place they have left behind. That continued presence, that inability to achieve the psychological distance that genuine flight would produce, suggests someone who is either geographically closer than investigators may currently be searching, or someone who is so embedded in the media ecosystem surrounding this case that geographic distance has become irrelevant. Someone who is watching every press conference, reading every article, seeing every Instagram post from Savannah Guthrie, living day by day inside the coverage of the crime they committed. That is an unusual profile. and it is an actionable one. Because someone who cannot stop consuming the coverage of their own crime makes behavioral choices that reflect that consumption. They visit the same websites repeatedly. They search specific names and keywords in ways that leave digital traces in server logs and search histories and device metadata. They may comment anonymously on articles or forums discussing the case, unable to resist the pull of the conversation that surrounds what they have done. They may have reached out to people adjacent to the investigation, journalists, tip lines, online communities dedicated to the case, in ways they believed were untraceable, but may not have been. Digital forensics in 2026 is not the digital forensics of a decade ago. The FBI's cyber division can work with internet service providers, platform operators, and device manufacturers to reconstruct the browsing and communication history of individuals who believe they have covered their tracks. The metadata that surrounds digital communication, the timestamps, the device signatures, the geographic markers embedded in connection data, survives attempts to erase it in ways that many people do not understand. If the person who wrote the letter used any digital means to draft it, transmit it, or research the case, and in 2026, the probability that a communication of this kind was entirely analog is very low, then there is a digital trail. It may be thin. It may require significant resources to reconstruct, but it exists. And investigators with 60 days of accumulated evidence, a behavioral profile constructed from the surveillance footage and the ransom notes, and the letter, and the full analytical resources of the FBI's cyber division are not looking at a blank wall. They are looking at a wall with a door in it. A door they have not yet opened, but a door they know is there. The letter is part of how they know it is there. Every communication the perpetrator makes is a risk they take. Every risk they take is a potential error. Every potential error is a thread that investigators pull. And threads, when pulled carefully and persistently in the direction they are already traveling, eventually reveal the pattern they are part of. 60 days in, with a letter in a newsroom and $1 million on the table, and the FBI's full analytical infrastructure engaged, the question is not whether this case will be resolved. The question is when. And the answer to when depends, more than any other single factor, on whether the person who wrote the word sorry will write something else, say something else, do something else that gives investigators the thread they need. Guilt does not resolve itself. It accumulates, it presses, it finds expression in behavior, in communications, in patterns, in the small decisions people make when they are carrying something too heavy to carry in complete silence. The letter was one expression of that guilt. It will not be the last. Investigators are certain of that, and they are waiting, patiently, systematically, with 60 days of evidence and a behavioral profile that grows more detailed with every communication and every silence and every day that passes without an arrest and without a location and without the answer that a family in Tucson and New York and wherever Cameron Guthrie is right now is waiting for with everything they have. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, taken January 31st, 2026, missing 60 days, a pacemaker that went silent at 2:28 in the morning, blood on her own front porch, a letter in a newsroom that says, sorry. 1-800-CALL-FBI, 520-351-4900. $1 million. The search for truth continues.